I'd like to just highlight right at the outset that craft obviously is a highly complex term, and one that doesn't have any obvious corresponding term in other languages. So already when we think about craft in a project of this kind, which is so international, we have a very interesting, intriguing, and somewhat provocative subject in our teeth, and so that gives us already a lot to work with, certainly gave me a lot to work with. The way that I chose to interpret this, and I'll say a lot more about this, but when selecting the 6 artists, I was looking for people who, first of all, embraced making with a great deal of commitment and intensity, and considered their making to be the essence of their form generation. In other words, the language of their work, the visual vocabulary of their work, developed organically out of their process, and also that they had a very strong relationship to materials. And as you'll see, the 6 artists all work in different materials, each of which has a very strong link to the particular place that they're from. So these are, if you like, culturally charged materials that they're working in. Another principle that came directly from Olivier was the idea of non-co-visibility, and this was also the case with the first groundwork, which of course happened in 2020 and 2021 during the pandemic, so it was a great gift to the audience at that time when the museum's galleries were closed. And the idea here is that one should not be able to see any of the works from the other works, so that each one has its own pure relationship to the landscape and is not in dialogue with another sculpture, as you would again have in the galleries. Now, it so happens that if you come with us on the walking tour, if you stand in the right spot by the pond, by Javier Senosian's amazing serpent, which I think you probably all have seen, and you look way up the hill past Thomas Schutte's crystal, you'll actually see Malayan Naif's marble sculpture just as a little white patch. So I'm really sorry about that, Olivier. Accidents do happen, but by and large, really each sculpture sits in the landscape in a very powerful way, communing with the trees, the animals, the sky, the earth underneath. And then finally, and this was maybe the most important thing for me, I was looking for artists whose work was accessible. Now, that's a word we use a lot these days, often in the context of what's now become a very politically charged debate around diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. I think this relates to that debate, but I mean it in a rather more specific and perhaps primary sense, in that I feel strongly that craft offers a kind of welcome or an invitation to explore, because frankly, it's a lot easier if you're a kid, an adult, an artist, a non-artist, really no matter who you are. It's really I think intuitive and instinctive to ask when you first encounter an amazing work of art, how was that made? Which I would insist is not a means of dumbing down the work, but actually a means of opening it up. Because when you really understand making in its full dimensionality, what you quickly find, and I'll try to prove this to you over the course of the next few minutes, is that the conceptual framework and the depth and richness of the work actually evolves out of the process of making. So the more you understand the object materially, the more richness there is in terms of its conceptual range for you. So those are the working principles. I'll just rapidly now go through the artists to introduce you to them and give you a sense of what their previous work has been like. Beginning with our American artist, who is Hugh Hayden, who is originally from Texas, but now based in New York, and really has established himself in the last 15 years and a little bit more as one of the most exciting sculptors in the country. Hugh is best known perhaps for his investigations into the theme of the American dream, which he treats not as a nightmare, which is something that people will sometimes say in a very kind of caustic and satirical way, but quite on the contrary, Hugh's work is animated by a real appreciation of the idealism, the utopian instincts, the sense of community that anchors this concept of the American dream from the largest city to the smallest town, and particularly as it's embodied in objects like park benches, or sorry, I should say picnic tables with benches, and here the idea of the picket fence, which is a very cannily chosen motif, as you'll immediately appreciate, because on the one hand it stands for a certain kind of good living, maybe in suburbia, and on the other hand, of course, it is a dividing line. And what he's done is to append, in this case, these thorns. You also see it here in this dining table that looks in many respects as if it could come from a middle class or lower class home. But what he's done is to weaponize them by carving these thorns into the wood. And it's important to note that, as in the piece that we've had, that he's made for groundwork, this is all integral. So he's essentially sculpting a plank with an attached protuberance out of it, as you can imagine, quite a feat of craftsmanship. So I use the term weaponized because obviously the sharpness of these projections suggests that you should not approach this object, and it does suggest a certain kind of latent violence that is inherent in the idea of the American dream and the way that that can be turned into a negative kind of energy. But on the other hand, there's also a real beauty and subtlety to his work with these motifs. This is his amazing work, Briar Patch, which was originally developed for Madison Square Park in New York City. And here you can see the image, obviously, is that of school desks. So you have this image of en masse education, again, the idea of a community, and perhaps an idea of a generation of people all brought together. And here materialized in the form of these objects which have branches sprouting from them. And again, the branches will be integral with the rest of the wood. So there's an insistence on a kind of connectivity that is completely alien to the normal methodology and vocabulary of woodworking, where of course you have the clean cut of the wood, and then that goes kind of downstream into your local Home Depot, and it's thought of as lumber, and it's not really any more clearly related genealogically to the tree than, as Hugh likes to say, than a chicken McNugget is to a bird, right? And he said something great about this body of work, which is that if that's how you normally encounter lumber, then his work is sort of like encountering a chicken drumstick with the foot still on it, right? So a kind of connection to the reality of this material. So here's his initial sketch, very first drawing for the work, and it's called The End. And in fact, if you take a certain route through the show, it would be the last thing that you see in the show. So I'm sort of starting here at the beginning with the end. And here, I told you I was going to be coy. So this is the work still under its tarp. So just giving you a little bit of a hint of its form. So a giant rib cage, perhaps suggesting that a whale has somehow not only perished, but also plummeted from the sky and landed in the Clark's forest. Also, you might think of it as a kind of fallen giant, and of course there are all fallen giants all over the property, the trees. Again, the branches are integral with the ribs and have been subtly carved in one piece. And there's even a sense, kind of uncanny, surrealist sense, that once we go through the entire 1 year duration of the show, that it might come back to life and these branches would sprout leaves. It has that very strong sense of animation to me, and I think animism is a very important aspect of his work in general, and very, very intensely present here. One thing I'll mention about this piece, which is a bit special, and I'll mention in a minute, as true of another work in the show as well, is that this will actually be allowed to live here forever. And given that it's an image of death, that's quite ironic and intriguing. But it's going to decay into the soil. So, of course, the ground gave life to the trees. The trees have been partly reshaped, but with this very strong presence of their initial form, and then it's going to be allowed gradually over many years to finally return into the earth again, which is a really, I think, a very powerful idea and really reframes the nature of the artwork. This sense of deep time is also very important in Milena Naef's work. So she is from a family of Swiss stone carvers and sculptors, and was brought up really surrounded by the artisanal knowledge and material intelligence of that craft, but didn't feel that she could necessarily enter into the trade herself, as she said it was too close to her. So she went off to art school and started making these absolutely amazing works that she gives the title Fleeting Parts. And as you can see, what she's done is to very subtly carve by hand a negative space into which her own body can fit. So it's a kind of elegant and possibly critical commentary on the tradition of the classical nude, or the classical figure. And she's placing herself to some extent in that position, but obviously in a very temporary way, because these really are almost like sculptures that are principally made to make photographs. There's also an interesting thing there about the photograph as capturing one instant, and the stone is being very, 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 very slow in its formation. Millennia are required to create this incredible metamorphic rock with all of its figure. And so she's creating this very powerful contrast between the momentary and the eternal, or the nearly eternal. Also, as you can imagine, this is a very personal project, because what she's done is find a way through form to literally insert herself in the story of her family. So you have this multi-generational procession of stone carvers with their incredible skill, their, I almost want to say, culture of stoneworking, which, as I said, she didn't feel that she could be part of in the same way, but she's become literally part of it in a totally different, quite conceptual way. Now, obviously, there was a question as to how we would take this project here to the Clark, because we weren't about to ask Milena to stand out in the cold for a whole year. There was this piece that Milena had made, which I guess was an early point of departure for us, because it made us start thinking about how this idea of the fleetingness, the ephemeral, in relation to the solidity and indeed the monumentality of this marble would relate to an object, a stationary object. And what Milena ultimately did was to create a work that almost serves as a kind of encapsulation or summary of everything that she's been thinking about in this series, all in one absolutely enormous 3-ton marble sculpture that was made in, from Swiss marble with help from a team of very skilled carvers that she knew through her family connections. And then what she did was to carve a gap for herself, a negative impression, again, of her own body, into which she could fit. And that was done by casting herself. So here she is enrobed in plaster. And then when she had that cast taken, she then used a pointing machine, if you know what that is, the traditional sculptural mechanism for getting a shape from one sculpture to another, or from a negative to a positive, and then made the gap that you'll see in the sculpture if you go out and have a look at it. Also important to say that the scale of this sculpture presented absolutely awe-inspiring technical challenges. So again, it had to be carved in Europe and then brought here. And so there was a lot of engineering that went into this. And absolutely critical here is the interlocking joint that Milena had designed, which is really executed to the absolute millimeter, probably finer than that. So it has to be very, very, very perfect, because you have two pieces of stone, each of which weigh 1.5 tons, that are engaged across this diagonal joint. So it's a kind of, it's quite an austere, abstract gesture in one way, but in another way, it's a demonstration of surpassing material control. And then one thing you're not seeing in these slides is that there's also an engagement with a fallen tree that was sourced from the landscape. And Milena and I will talk more about that in the tour later if you have a chance to join us. But here's Milena carving herself into the slab, sort of carving herself in the negative, like making her own ghost, you could say. Laura Ellen Bacon comes to us from Derbyshire in the UK. She was raised by a mother who farmed and a father who was an architect and also an artist. And that family background, again, was very important to her in the formation of her work. She remembers growing up in the raspberry canes that would pile up on the family property. And ultimately, she chose to work in the kind of similar material, willow strands, each of which is about the dimension of a finger, and once soaked in water, become extremely flexible. And so it can become this very instantaneous, intuitive sculpting medium in her hands. And she developed a, completely unique and self-invented method of working with this material. Sometimes people will say that it looks like a basket or like a bird's nest, but actually it's not much like that in terms of its structure at all. It's really a unique constructive language that she's developed. And as you can see, she's also very interested in working with different types of willow, with different surface qualities, different colors. It can be treated in various ways. You know, the bark can be stripped, it can be boiled, it can be used in a more raw state. The Ohio-grown willow that she's used in our sculpture is the first time, I believe, that she's had a wide range of different expressions of a willow species, so that you get a lot of different colors in the willow, and so it's very painterly, rather than the kind of monochrome effect that she's often achieved in her other sculptures. This is a work in a sort of related accumulative compositional method, but using field stone. And I think it's important to say that just as Hugh Hayden is drawing from this American vernacular woodworking tradition, and Milena Naif is working from this very exalted European stone carving and sculpting tradition, what Laura Ellen Bacon is doing is really drawing from the energies of agricultural crafts and the intelligence of the British countryside, which of course is where she's from. This, again, is a very early design for our sculpture, which I have to say doesn't really look a lot like what's ultimately been made, but the crucial conceptual breakthrough here was that Laura decided that every constituent volume of the sculpture would represent one day of her labor. And what she did was actually to come here to the Clark and spend a full month of May basically, making the sculpture entirely by hand by herself. So when you go and see it, that's just 30 days of solid effort, basically, with a few breaks. I think also fair to say that it was raining a lot, and so she was basically doing this in a mudslide. And when you go and see it, I would love you to particularly look at the bottom of the piece, and this is also true of this amazing work that she also completed, if you can believe this, the month before she came here, she did this. So no rest in between virtually. And this is at Yorkshire Sculpture Park in a decommissioned chapel on the property of the sculpture park, again up in the north of England. And I wanted to use this just to show you the way that the sculpture meets the floor, because it might immediately occur to you if you were imagining trying to make this, how would you do that? How would you wind that and get all of that to interlace in such a tight, perfect contour? And the answer is that she does it lying down. So she actually spent quite a lot of time making our sculpture here at the Clark, as well as this one, prone, lying flat, working with her hands. So this is full body contact sculpture, you might say. Abu Bakr Fofana comes to us from both Mali and France. He was born in Mali and had a very deep and sustaining encounter with ancestral knowledge, particularly that of his own grandmother, who was a herbalist and healer in the community in Mali. But then he, still as a child, moved to France and was raised there as well, and has a very strong relationship to both places. And I think I could say that he's here, and do have a close look at his outfit, because it's gorgeous, and his own example of his own manufacture. But he somehow combines the soulful depth of African spirituality and knowledge of botany and mineral knowledge as well with French couture, and has those two kinds of intelligence both mixed into his work. He's particularly known for working in this West African cotton, which is quite different from the cotton that we encounter as an industrial product. Most of us are probably wearing mass-produced cotton, which is very water-hungry and very ecologically damaging, and this is quite a different plant, actually, that he works with. And for our project, he adapted something that he had been thinking about already, which is this idea of making a very narrow width band of cotton and then winding it. So this is woven by hand on a small traditional loom, and each of the coils, like this one, that you see in the work, include something like 60 to 70 meters of fabric. So it's like 2/3 of the length of a football field, each of these circular shapes that he's made. I first encountered Abu Bakr's work in Documenta, the great art exhibition in Kassel, And it was just a revelation to see what he was able to do with the traditional dye of indigo, which he really is the greatest master. I would certainly say in Africa, possibly internationally, has the deepest understanding of this very, very important traditional dye stuff. And when I say ancestral knowledge, I mean that quite literally, because once he got interested in the plant, initially not for its dyeing properties actually, but as an anti-inflammatory, a kind of medicinal plant, he went deeply into its potential as a colorant and learned that there was a kind of cosmic array of 12 different shades, each with very precise naming, very precise spiritual associations, symbolic import. And he reconstructed that by traveling across West Africa, speaking to older weavers and dyers, and then was able to bring that knowledge into his work. This again is an early sketch for what he might do here, as you can see when you see the eventual sculpture, very, very different in its form, but it does assume the shape of what's called a banangolo, which is basically a tree of life from a Western African religious tradition. And you can see that what he did was to have this idea of a metal structure into which he would impregnate these seeds, as he calls them, which are these amazing compressed bands of cotton. And the colors are absolutely exquisite, delicate, sensitive, with the kind of nuance that you would see in a Constable painting, but from a totally different material source. Here they are, newly made, stacked up on his farm in Mali. And what you're seeing is, of course, the different shades of indigo, which are generated through a loving attention to a vat in which the dye is cured. Over the course of 9 months. Important to say that that's the same amount of time as a human gestation. And he also will work with plant-based mordants and mud-based mineral dyes to get these ochres and reds and browns that you'll see in the work. So it's a real emanation of the earth on many levels, both materially and in terms of its knowledge base, and also in terms of its, I suppose you might say, its expressive range is that of the earth itself. That's also certainly true of Yo Akiyama, who's, I think fair to say, the greatest living ceramic sculptor in Japan. And if you know anything about Japan's relationship to ceramics, you'll have an appreciation of what that means. So it's a real honor to have him here in the show. He's a very, very eminent figure within that very long-standing and highly respected tradition. And Akiyama Sensei is particularly known, has a very wide range of visual vocabulary in his work, but he's particularly well known for these geological effects where he uses the drying of the clay and also the treatment of the surface, often with iron powder, to create this very, very rich, very intense, very subtle surface that looks actually perhaps more like cast bronze than it does like anything you've seen in ceramic. For our exhibition, he actually did a years-long research project developing a stoneware clay that would survive outside, and particularly would be able to survive down to very low temperatures, like negative 12 degrees, which of course might happen here in Williamstown. And this is not something that Akiyama Sensei had done previously. So this was a very taxing and impressive project from a technical point of view. But I think he would mainly want us to focus on the form. So these are, again, some early sketches that Akiyama Sensei made, and I'll let you read what he wrote about this just for a second. So what he's thinking about here, I hesitate to put words in his mouth, but what he's thinking about here is the fact that a tree is half seen and half unseen. So it comes up from the ground, but you also have this invisible structure that's just as important to the tree, but is unknown by us. And he wanted to make a sculpture that would have that kind of relationship between earth and sky. So originally he thought about actually suspending one of his sculptures from the tree, but he decided that was too risky to the tree. He also thought about actually having it kind of suspended on two guy wires, almost like a pendulum or a kind of plumb bob that would be swiveling gently in the breeze. But again, very, very technically difficult to achieve that. And what you'll see on the show eventually is that he went for a completely different vector, where you just had this funneling, spiraling form just powerfully pushing up out of the earth, and the constituent parts of it, which you see him making here, are stacked up in this modular but highly, highly variable muscular vortex of this material. And this is, this is a very, very large, perhaps 14, 15 foot high sculpture that, again, even fired after the water has evacuated out of the clay, will weigh, I think, something on the order of 1.5 tons. So it's an absolutely monumental undertaking. Here it is when it's fired, one part of it, and so you can see it's fired red. And then he will put the iron powder onto it and get that incredible saturnine black surface that you'll see on it, which again is very metallic and almost seems like it contains the energies of the night sky. Then finally, Javier Senosian comes to us from Mexico City, where he has established himself as the greatest exponent of what he calls architectura organica, which is, say, organic architecture, and he's created this absolutely astounding complex called the Nida de Quetzalcoatl, so the nest of Quetzalcoatl, who is, of course, the feathered serpent god of the Aztecs. And I'm baffled that this isn't better known in this country. It is one of the most extraordinary architectural achievements of the past century, really on the scale of Gaudi in Barcelona or Nika de Saint Phal, her creations in France. It's a kind of fantasy landscape, much of which is realized with this extremely intensely made decorative polychromatic mosaic, which he also has recently begun applying to these sculptures. Now, this is one of his coata, which is the Nahuatl word for snake or serpent. And I encountered this work at the Noguchi Museum in an exhibition called In Praise of Caves. And it is, at least as far as I know, completely fortuitous that we have this wonderful Noguchi show, Garden of Time, arriving at exactly the same moment as the great serpent that Senosian has made, because that's actually a conversation that's been going on, at least in my mind, and I think in his mind, for several years now. And this, you can see, is very materially similar, although in a very different palette, to the one here. The one that we have is purple, which of course is the color of Williams and the purple hills and purple flowers, but it also has even more energy to it, just crackling across its surface. And when you see the light playing off the different refractory facets of these glazed shaped tiles, it just feels alive. It feels like it's come up out of the water and is sort of rising to greet you. And what's so wonderful about this project for me, and positioning it where we have in Scow Pond, welcoming people into the campus of the Clark, is that on one level, well, it's obviously extremely impressive in terms of its scale, like so many of the other works we have in groundwork, but it's kind of funny in a way, and it's something that almost seems like it was made with an audience of children in mind. You could almost imagine it being at a children's museum, perhaps. But then, on the other hand, it has this relationship to a spiritual tradition, which was, of course, almost completely destroyed by colonialism, by the violence against the Aztec people, to which Senosian is paying tribute here. And even beyond that, a sense of divinity and how the divine can be materialized in the form of a sculpture and the transcendent possibilities of that. So this work travels this range from, as I said earlier, the most accessible, in a way a statement of pure joy, to these very, very difficult, highly politically traumatic events of the past, which go right to the heart of what it means to be living in the Americas at all, and the fact that any of us are sitting here, that history, and that political history, that religious history, are all captured in this work of kind of supreme lightness, which I think is a wonderful thing that he's achieved, and just so extraordinary to have it here at the Clark, welcoming people to the show and to the institution. So here's the map, here's what we'll walk later if you're free to join us. And what I now want to do is, as promised, give you a little bit more of my thinking about what it means to do an exhibition about craft in this context. So what I want to do is try to take you over the horizon line and plunge into the question of what I'm calling forms of craft. Now, perhaps the best way to start this conversation is to remind us all that craft is an English word, right? And it doesn't, as I said earlier, have any direct association or translation in several other languages, in fact, most other languages in the world. Also, within English, it has a highly contested and difficult relationship to these other English words, especially art or artist, design, designer, maker, artisan. And all of these words imply a slightly different set of preoccupations. They have a real politics to them. Often, traditionally, the idea of craft has been associated with the working class, with people who are not white, with women rather than men, and the term fine art has been associated, of course, with white European men. So there's already a kind of asymmetry built into these relationships. I wrote a book called The Invention of Craft, which is all about this, and the basic argument there is that craft had to be invented as the opposite of fine art and the opposite of industry in the late 18th century, and we should not treat this word as anything natural or assume that it's not already laced with problems from its very inception. And even when you think about the history of craft as it's been understood over the course of the last 250 years, what you'll constantly observe is that it's used both to relegate things to a subordinate position in the margins of the art world, for example, and really looked down on, and then conversely has been embraced precisely as a way of undoing that and trying to invert that hierarchy, as we've seen recently in museums' widespread embrace of ceramic and fiber art, for example. So it's constantly involved in this kind of power play where marginalized positions are being, or at least there's an attempt to forcefully bring them to the center, and then they're pushed back again. And all of these terms, we could talk about this all day, believe me, but all of these terms are imbricated in that complicated terrain. So that's English, but then you start thinking about other languages. So the Romance languages in general, I'm talking here, French, Italian, Spanish, they don't really have a word for craft in a direct sense, at least as far as I know. The word that you would often encounter would be in Spanish, I'm choosing Spanish because of architect Senosian, would be artesanía. You would often also encounter the term casero or casera, which means kind of housework, but not like doing the dishes, but rather a domestic occupation, like a domestic trade. And this term, in distinction to craft, which maybe implies something embodied, active, having to do with direct connection and shaping of materials, this is more of a professional term, artesania. It's more about trade identity, if you like. Then you have the Germanic tradition, which is actually where our word craft comes from. So you have the word craft with a K, which just means power. I always try to remind people of that craft, despite having this subordinate position, that etymologically it just means potency. But that's actually not the word that you'll normally encounter when you're talking about things that are handmade. Instead, you will see this word Handwerk, which to me implies obviously handmadeness in our sense of the English term, but also an emphasis on labor and a sense of value being created through the act of making. Also worth pointing out that the term Kraftwerk, power plant, and the band, that's the same etymology. So in the sense, the craft in the sense of power has this broader range of associations in which craft is centrally located. And then almost finally, we have the Japanese world of terms for craft, of which I've only put a few on the screen. And this is a highly, highly elaborate vocabulary that has an extremely intricate and, again, very contested history to it. The word minge, from Minshiteki Koge, basically means crafts of the common people, and that's the one I'll focus on. But you also have Bijutsu Koge, which means basically fine art crafts, so artistic crafts. You have Dento Koge, which means traditional craft. You have Korafto, which, as you can hear, is a appropriation of the English term, which, as far as I know, basically means industrial objects made to look as if they were handmade. And that's a term that came about actually in the American occupation. It was especially common then to mean things that were going to be exported back to the United States and brought back by GIs. So that's crafto. And then you have objet, which basically means conceptual or avant-garde objects that probably are also made by hand but are sculptures. So that's kind of a material version of conceptual art. So as you can appreciate, a lot of complexity here. But I thought it might be interesting to share a little bit more about this term minge, because it really gets to the heart of a lot of the issues that are at stake when you think about craft in relation to art, particularly the question of intention and agency. So for most of us, the term minge is primarily associated with this man, Soetsu Yanagi, who was the primary theoretician of the Minge movement, which unfolded in the early 20th century. And this book, The Unknown Craftsman, identified minge, so folk crafts, as being valuable precisely because they were not exactly anonymous, though they were, so unknown craftspeople, but valuable because they were unthought, they were instinctive. And he chose as the ultimate emblem of this philosophy this tea bowl, the Kazaimon Ido, so it's a 16th century Korean tea bowl that came to Japan subsequently and then was embraced within tea culture as a kind of iconic exemplar of what ceramics could and should be. And what he wrote about it was this, I'll just read it to you. When I saw it, my heart fell. A good tea bowl, yes, but how ordinary. So simple, no more ordinary thing could be imagined. The clay had been dug from the hill at the back of the house. The glaze was made with the ash from the hearth. The potter's wheel had been irregular. The shape revealed no particular thought. It was one of many. The work had been fast, the turning was rough, done with dirty hands, the throwing slipshod, the glaze had run over the foot. The throwing room had been dark. A beautiful detail. The thrower could not read. The kiln was a wretched affair, the firing careless. Sand had stuck to the pot, but nobody minded. No one invested the thing with any dreams. It is enough to make one give up working as a potter. But that is how it should be. The plain and unagitated, the uncalculated, the harmless, the straightforward, the natural, the innocent, the humble, the modest. Where does beauty lie, if not in these qualities? So if you want an ideology of an object, I humbly submit that that is one. It creates around this object and invests in it an extraordinary range of associations, and also sets up Yanagi, obviously, as the connoisseur of this unthoughtness, this plainness, this unagitatedness, this kind of peasant intelligence that cannot recognize itself, and so must be nominated from the outside as being valuable. And needless to say, Akiyama sensei is not a Minge potter, right? So the crucial point here would be that Akiyama sensei is highly aware of this tradition and the associations that have been brought to ceramics, and what he's doing is stepping outside of that tradition of, you might say, enforced humility, and making this vauntingly ambitious object that instead communicates with artists like Henry Moore and Brancusi, and yet also paying attention to this aesthetic. And think about the cracking and the rifts and the opening up of what he's made in relation to the surface of this object, for example. So that's the kind of subtle, multivariable conversation that's happening across time in this example. And of course, I could show you many, many other Japanese ceramics from very different points in time, which Akiyama sensei is reacting to. Let's think about Africa for a minute. We have the figure of Amadou Hampâté Bâ, who is perhaps as important, although a bit later on, as important in the formulation of ideas around African crafts as Yanagi was in the Japanese context. And he wrote a text that actually Abu Bakr shared with me he encountered when he was young that had a tremendous impact on him and was very formative for his own work. And I'll just take a couple of quotes from this. Ba, who was a kind of, a poet, a literary figure, wrote that art, African art, was in fact a religion unto itself, a form of participation in the forces of life, and a way of belonging to both the visible and the invisible worlds. Perfect description of what Abu Bakr has made over the course of his career and here for groundwork. But again, we have a very contested situation here because most of the African artworks, and here I'm showing a Bamana mask from the Kono Association, so from a masquerade association. This work stands at the origin point of, frankly, tourist crafts, right? So these traditions are distorted and compressed and violated under the conditions of colonialism, so that, as Ba writes, it goes without saying that secular art has developed chiefly since the colonial era, and it has become very rare to discover an authentic and spiritually loaded object. So here you have a craft tradition, which again, and I can't emphasize this enough, we might call it that, but obviously there is no term for craft in West African languages that corresponds to ours, and there are also, as in Japan, prior to the 19th century, there's no clean distinction between craft and art and design. Those just aren't distinctions that are made in that context. Those classifications don't even exist, and we have to unthink them when trying to understand an object like this. But there's a kind of disruption of that tradition, which is brought about by the imperial transformation of Africa. And into this situation come artists, in fact, like Hugh Hayden, who here is working with the image of the African mask, and of course also the image of the American skillet. So as I said, he's very well known for his woodwork, but also has worked in lots of other media. So here he's working in cast iron, another very beloved vernacular object that he's here transforming. And this work is called The Cosbys. So here he's alluding both, or triply I could say, to campground cooking, or making cornbread. He has a great recipe, by the way. He's alluding, of course, to the African mask, and he's also alluding to the 1980s TV show and the disgraced figure of Bill Cosby. And he said something very beautiful about this, which was that when he was growing up, the Cosby Show was very important to him, and he watched it a lot, and that he felt that even given what had happened around Bill Cosby and what we know about him now as a figure, he still had this desire to hold on to that aspirational quality. And that's so similar, if you think about it, to the way that you might feel about African masks when you see them in a museum, right? They've been violated. They've been somehow, maybe not degraded, but certainly decontextualized by being brought here to places like the Metropolitan Museum. And yet we also still want to value their original cultural encoding and value. So he's, again, traversing this very difficult terrain in this work, just as Abu Bakr is in his sculpture here for us. And I think the lesson here is that craft, far from being this kind of neutral, simple means, as you see here in this famous or infamous line of Jackson Pollock's, technique is just a means of arriving as a statement. This could not be more wrong, because in fact technique is always shot through with pre-existing, not just ideas, but pre-existing problematics, pre-existing contending cultural histories. And when you pick up a craft, what you pick up is all of that at once. So although the show is very accessible and immediate and joyous, and as Olivier said, very optimistic, it has just under the surface all of this deep water. And all of these artists are, in a way, navigating those waters. And it's not just their hands and their manual dexterity and their skill that they're bringing to the creation of these works. It's also their understanding of what all of that means. So I just want to close by expressing another fond hope that I have for this show, which is that when people come back to the Clark inside after seeing it on the hill or out on Scout Pond, they will see everything in the museum differently, because it might occur to them that everything they're seeing in the museum is a craft object. So here's one of the most famous works in the show, in the museum, Sargent's Fumée d'ambergris, so the smoke of ambergris, this absolutely lavishly gorgeous piece of painting, right? And here's a detail, and I really just wanted to put this up 20 feet wide for you. So all these whites playing off of one another, and it occurs to you, of course, when you stand in front of this work, this Orientalist work, that perhaps the painting is an excuse for itself to be painted, and that really the subject of this painting is not the woman and not the setting and not the smoke, but it's actually white. and it's Sargent's pure and loving and perpetual wonderment at his own skill that you're seeing demonstrated in front of you. Or think about this lesser known work, but very relevant for my purposes here, this Jules Dalou sculpture, which is one of innumerable plasticizing sculptures from the 19th century, immaculately made. It was unbelievable skill, almost at the level of a Bernini, not quite, but this incredible nuance of surface, which became, in fact, quite commonplace in French and other European sculpture in the 19th century because it was such a prioritized and highly honored discipline. And think about this work in relation to Milena Naif's work and the kind of confidence and, again, the kind of trade, professional identity, I want to say, that is embedded in a work like this. This is, in fact, Dalou, you see him here on the left, and that's his workshop. So a real, not a factory, but an atelier, a real space of work, right? A real space of production and skill, messy, highly technical, a lot of engineering. It's a lot of work, a lot of labor going to these objects. But there's this kind of insistence on a certain elegance, a certain naturalness, a certain quality of as if the sculpture had been born or imagined rather than coming out of this dirty, messy place. And think about her own play of the positive and negative, of carving her ghost into these slabs, as being a rejoinder to that sense that craft can sort of assert itself in that way. So hopefully, having seen Milena Naif's sculpture, you will have a very different relationship to the sculptures that you see inside. And last point I want to make, or nearly last point, is that there's something even more basic than anything I've said so far, which is this question of touch and this question of physicality, or what I call material intelligence. And for me, the great theorist, if I can put it that way, of this subject has always been Helen Keller, who of course had no other way of accessing the world around her, being deaf and blind, and said this, I'll read it aloud because it's so good. Touch brings the blind many sweet certainties that our more fortunate fellows miss because their sense of touch is uncultivated. When they look at things, they put their hands in their pockets. No doubt that is one reason why their knowledge is so often vague, inaccurate, and useless. So that's Helen Keller giving you a little shade, uncommonly. But her, once she also wrote, I think it's in the same text, in fact, that when she would greet a friend, she would hold their hand, and she would know exactly how they were feeling. And when the seasons changed, as will happen here at the Clark, she felt that she had so much more appreciation of the onset of fall or the arrival of spring than somebody who could see, because she was only getting it on her skin, right? And I feel like that is also happening in this show, that, in a way, wave away all the issues about art and craft and even the political and cultural histories that I've been trying to describe for you in very brief form this morning, as important as those are, and remember how primary craft is as in relation to form itself. So if you try to experience the show, if you can, as Helen Keller would. I realize we have these do not touch signs, which slightly cuts against what I'm saying, but even if you only imagine it, or imagine the artists having this relationship to their work and the forms that they're finding in these materials, the prospect that art and nature actually have the same relationship to form rather than opposing ones, that culture and nature are actually not opposed but actually joined together in the idea of form, I think is perhaps the most important discovery that could come out of this show. That's certainly what I've come away feeling, because all of these works are based on natural forms, right? The human body, trees, nests, bones, stone, sprouting seeds. And even if you were to look up at the night sky and see the stars in their incredible celestial geometry and the form of the astronomical cosmos in which we sit, which I think is so important, especially for Abba Bakr and for architect Senosian. The way that these objects seem to happen before your eyes in the way that nature itself does, and that there's a symmetry being created there. I think that I don't want to say it could only happen by embracing craft and putting that at the center of the project, but I certainly think it doesn't hurt. It really gets you to that place. Now, I do have one last thing that I want to do for you, but first I'm going to do some thank yous. So it would be really negligent if I didn't recognize, first of all, James Ewing, who took all the photographs I've been showing you of the works. And we also have Miko McGinty, who's designing the book in which these photographs will be placed. So we don't have it yet, obviously, because the works were just installed and we had to take the photographs. Now we have to make the book. But I think by September or so, we're going to have an exhibition catalog. So this is also a little bit of our product placement moment. I've come back and get the book then, writing by myself and also a group of really wonderful essayists who have contributed texts about the different times of day that you might encounter the show, so morning, afternoon, evening, and night. So it's a 24-hour experience. I also want to thank the galleries that helped with the, as I say, incredible engineering of the works, particularly Friedman Benda Gallery and Renato Del Riego, and Joan Mervis Gallery and Megan Jones. So Friedman Benda represented architect Senosian, Joan Mervis represents Akiyama Sensei, and Renata Del Riego and Megan Jones served as our translators because, in fact, we needed that help to work with them in their studios. Also wanted to thank Abby Hinnell Gallery, who represents Laura Ellen Bacon, and Listen Gallery representing Hugh Hayden. And then I'm going to do something that you should never do, which is try to thank the museum staff, because, of course, you always forget somebody. But I cannot say enough about working with this institution. As Olivier said, I'm principally a guest curator, so I work with museums across the world, and I have never had a better experience than I've had working with this incredible team. So I just want to mention a few pieces. Yes, absolutely. Again, thanking everybody who's been involved, because it's really been, the proverb, it takes a village, has never been more true. But I want to start with Dan Wallace, who is the kind of craftsperson of the craftspeople. So probably most of you don't know Dan, but he was the person that actually was the kind of logistical mind here at the Clark that helped us with all this engineering and rigging and installation. Again, with the team, but has been incredibly creative and really a master craftsman in his own right, a sort of craftsman of the exhibition. Obviously, would like to thank Olivier for his leadership and inspiring ideas that animated the project. The curatorial team, so Kathy Morris, who's retiring this year, and Esther Bell. Rob Wiesenberger, who I understand was actually the person who suggested me for the show, so I'm particularly grateful to him. And he also contributed to the book. Patty Tainter, our registrar, the whole education team, particularly want to mention the head of the department, Rona Ostheimer, and Will Schemmer, who helped organize today, including the complex campaign of the walking tour we're going to have. Let's see, Maureen and Zach in the grants department, Vicky Saltzman, who's been head of getting the word out, Caroline McCormick and others in that department. The publications team, as I mentioned, we're going to have a book. So that would be Kevin Bicknell, Anne Rookline, and Liz Lewis. And then extra special, super duper, triple heaping thanks with whipped cream and a cherry on top to Teresa O'Toole. So I've been trying to think about how to describe what Teresa has done over the past 4 years, and words actually do fail me here. I want to say it's almost been like working with a co-curator who is like the other half of my brain. So I'm not much good at logistics. And her title is project manager, but suffice to say that does not come close to covering it. So pretty much everything that happened in the show, Teresa was both the foundation stone and the last resort, if I could put it that way, so the alpha and omega. And everything that happened that went well ultimately was because Teresa was making sure that it would, if you like. And Teresa is also now leaving the Clark, taking time with her kids. She's been here 17 and a half years, something like that. Has, not just for this groundwork, but also the first one and many, many other projects, has been one of the critical pieces of human infrastructure who has made the Clark what it has been over the past 2 decades. So massive, massive thanks to her. And now, as I said, I'm going to close with one last thing, which is actually not my words, but the words of Mary Oliver, the great poet and nature writer. So I was trying to think about how to bring this to an end, and it occurred to me that, you know, a great thing you could do when you're seeing the show is to look up at the sky and look at the clouds, which you could say almost are anti-form because they're always changing and they are sort of natural abstraction in the same way that, you know, Sargent found abstraction in the folds of that garment. We see abstraction floating above us, and maybe in some way the trees are abstract. We were talking to Akiyama Sensei about this yesterday. You know, where does abstraction begin and representation end? But this passage, I think, is a wonderful way of understanding form and understanding how natural form and crafted form ultimately amount to the same thing. So here it goes. This is the last thing I'm going to say. Form is certainty. All nature knows this, and we have no greater advisor. Clouds have forms, porous and shape-shifting, bumptious and fleecy. They are what clouds need to be clouds. See a flock of them come on the sled of the wind, all kneeling above the blue sea. Every form sets a tone, enables a destiny, strikes a note in the universe unlike any other. How can we stop looking? How can we ever turn away? Thank you. We're having a discussion about whether we have time for Q&A. No, the answer is no, but you can ask me questions just by coming to find me. Thank you so much for your attention. I hope you enjoy the stuff.